Hey guys, it's Brad from probateresource.com. Today I want to talk about contract red flags. Hey guys, this is Brad from probateresource.com. At Probate Resource, we're a real estate solutions company. We specialize in the world of probate and inheritance properties. We actually buy properties for cash, and we have a hand-picked network of real estate agents across the country we work with to help you get your probate and inheritance property sold. So today I want to talk specifically about contract red flags. I've done a bunch of other videos about, getting offers from other people and what you should look for and that sort of thing. Obviously, if you're watching this video, you're probably going to be selling a property that you've inherited, and you're probably getting offers from lots of people, and you're probably getting inundated with offers. And how do you sort of differentiate all the different offers you get, and how do you do that? I want to talk about contract red flags here, especially most of this has to do with the world of investors, right? I mentioned this in other videos, there's a lot of investors out there who don't actually have any money to buy your property. They're really just wholesaling your property to somebody else. And there's nothing wrong with wholesaling, but most of them are doing it totally wrong and totally incorrect. And all they're going to do is waste your time and jerk you around. And you're going to end up right back where you started and having to find a legitimate buyer because that contract you got fell through. So what do you need to look for in a contract that you get from an investor to figure out if it's a legitimate contract? Well, there's a few components. Number one, you need to pay attention to the time to close, for one thing. I have seen most investors advertise that they can pay cash and close quick. Everybody advertises. I don't even really do that anymore because everybody says that, right? And everybody does it. And if you're an investor, you should do that. You should pay cash and close quick, right? But the funny part is some of these people who say they pay cash and close quick, if you get their offer contract, they might have a 30, 45, 60-day close in that contract, which in my opinion is a long time for an investor to put a contract on a house to buy it. Typically speaking, most of our contracts at our companies are somewhere between 2 and 3 weeks to the closing time. 2 weeks, in my opinion, is probably, we've closed faster than 2 weeks before, but 2 weeks, in my opinion, gets to be a little crazy trying to get it done by the 2 weeks, because inevitably in a lot of situations and a lot of deals we do, there's either like a homeowners association or there's a mortgage payoff that needs to be obtained. Sometimes there's delinquent property taxes, and some of those things can actually hold up the closing because we can't close until we get that information back. And sometimes that holds it up. So generally speaking, 2 weeks, anything under 2 weeks gets to be a little crazy trying to get that deal closed in time. I'm not to say that we can't do it in that amount of time, but sometimes it gets a little crazy. So we usually do between 2 and 3 weeks. Now, there may be situations where the seller reaches out to us and says, hey, we need 60 days to close or whatever because there's a tenant in there. We need to offer them notice to vacate and we got to wait it out. That's fine, whatever. If you want 60 days, that's fine. But typically, we're going to offer you 2 to 3 weeks. But I have seen investors out there who offer like a 30, 45, 60-day closing timeline, which I think is a little crazy and long for an investor to be buying a house. That's like normal real estate transaction closing time. That's 30 days for a buyer to get a mortgage and obtain a loan and go through the process, right? It takes about 30 days or so. So that's number one. Number two, look at the due diligence period. I've got another video out there about due diligence and what that means. And the due diligence period is essentially the inspection period where someone buying your house can essentially, in that given time, they can usually sort of figure out whether they want to buy the property or not. And basically, if they cancel or renegotiate during that time period, they don't lose their earnest money deposit. Now, in some states, there's not an inspection period. It might be called like an option period. It just depends on the state you're operating in. But in that due diligence period, also called an inspection period, usually speaking, the buyer can back out or cancel the contract for any reason whatsoever and get their earnest money deposit back. Now, if it's past the due diligence period, usually speaking, depending on how the contract is worded, and make sure you pay attention to the contract, the due diligence period, if they canceled after that, the buyer would lose and they would forfeit their earnest money deposit. And in many cases, again, this depends on how your contract is worded, they would be able to you would get their earnest money deposit back. You would get to keep that as the seller. But again, Pay attention to the wording in the contract. Okay, so that's due diligence period. And a lot of investors out there do a really long due diligence period, which to me is kind of strange. Our standard is 10 days. That's pretty, 7 to 10 days is pretty much industry standard. But I've seen investors out there that have done, a 30-day due diligence period in their contract. And maybe they were going to close on the 31st day, which is kind of crazy, right? Because that basically gives them up until the day before closing to back out of the contract for any reason whatsoever and get all their earnest money back, and basically leave you as the seller hanging and having to go find another buyer. Maybe you get left at the close. I've heard from sellers who I showed up to closing and the investor never showed up to the closing, and they went totally dark on me, right? Usually these are the newbie guys. These are the inexperienced guys that are kind of jerking you around, and they tried to wholesale it to a buyer and they couldn't find a buyer, or last minute their buyer backed out of the property and they were planning on assigning that contract to this buyer, and then they left the buyer hanging. We don't operate that way at my company. If I tell you I'm going to buy your house, I'm going to buy your house because that's just the right thing to do, right? So in those cases, look for that really long due diligence period. If they've got a really long due diligence period, you should kind of question their seriousness in the contract. Also, you should pay attention to a very low earnest money deposit, or sometimes there might be zero earnest money. Now, depending on the state that you live in, some states require earnest money for real estate contracts, some states do not. You'll want to consult with an attorney in your specific area or do some research as to whether your specific state requires earnest money. Now, I live in the state of Georgia. I invest and buy properties all over the place, but I live in the state of Georgia, and I'm a licensed agent in the state of Georgia also. And I've been buying properties here for a number of years. And I've had real estate agents argue with me here. They say, no, earnest money is required by a contract. I said, no, it's not in the state of Georgia. It's not a legal requirement for a legally binding real estate contract in the state of Georgia. Now, in some states it is, but here in the state of Georgia, it's not. And I've had real estate agents argue with me about it. So I would say don't necessarily take your advice from a real estate agent. The best person to answer that question is going to be a real estate attorney who practices law in the world of real estate. They're going to be able to answer that question better than a real estate agent might be able to answer that question. And again, I'm an agent myself, so I can say that, right? Long due diligence period, long closing date, and earnest money, very little or no earnest money deposit at all. Typically speaking, from an earnest money perspective, 1% is very common. That's like kind of a common amount. It's been sort of common practice in the industry for a long time, is 1% of whatever the purchase price is sort of a common. Earnest money can be whatever you want it to be, really. It could be $1. It could be, but an earnest money kind of shows how serious the buyer is about it. There have been cases where we've been up against a bunch of other competition, and I have put up a significant amount of earnest money and say, hey, I'm willing to put up this much money here today to show you that I'm serious about the deal. So if you have a buyer who's maybe only putting up like $5 of earnest money, or there's no earnest money written in the contract at all, they're probably not really serious about actually buying your property. So make sure you pay attention to that. All right, let's go to the next one. And the next piece is going to be out clauses in the contract. So you want to make sure you read through that contract. Also, sometimes they'll use like a state approved contract, which might be a really long, wordy contract. Like we have one here in Georgia. It's called the Georgia Association of Realtors contract. Sort of a state approved contract that most realtors and agents use for transactions. In my cases, when I'm buying a property direct to seller for cash, I have a very simple like 3-page contract. The third page is literally just the signature. So it's really just 2 pages of verbiage. It's a very simple contract that I had my real estate attorney draft up many years ago. We took out a lot of the crap out of it. Especially in these state contracts, a lot of them were designed to protect brokers and agents. So 80% of the verbiage in those contracts is really just a legal protection for the broker and the agent involved in the transaction. It really has nothing to do with the buyer and the seller. So when I'm buying properties direct to seller, sometimes we don't use the state approved contract or the state realtor contract because there's not a realtor involved. It's a buyer and a seller. So we cut out all that crap. And again, I had an attorney draft this contract for me. Cuts out all the crap in there and makes it a little bit easier to understand. It's 2 pages. There's some legalese in there, but for the most part, I tried to have my attorney draft this in as simple and easy to understand as possible. And also, I didn't make it a very one-sided contract. Sometimes real estate investors will create like a very one-sided contract where it really heavily favors them and not you. So make sure, if you need to have an attorney review the contract, by all means. Sometimes sellers will ask us to say, hey, I'd like my attorney to review the contract. And some investors get scared of that, and they're like, and it's really the ones that have like kind of a lot of weasel clauses in their contract. They'll get scared of that and be like, no, you don't need to do that, da-da-da. I welcome it. If you ask me that your attorney wants to review my contract, like, great, what's his name? What's the email address? I'd be happy to send him the contract right now, have him take a look it over. And I've never had an attorney come back to me and say, hey, this contract is terrible and blah, 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 blah. Most of the time they're like, hey, can you change this one word right here? And I'll look at it and say, okay, if that makes the seller comfortable, sure, be happy to change that one word or strike through this one thing. Make sure you're paying attention to the contract for out clauses, read through it. There's a lot of out clauses. One of the most common ones that I've heard people brag about in our industry is subject to partner approval. But they don't tell you who the partner is. They don't tell you whether they have a partner at all. But it basically gives them the out clause where they can come back with an excuse after due diligence and say, hey, my partner decided that this deal's not going to work, so I'm going to have to cancel the contract. And per my contract right here, it says subject to partner approval. Well, my partner doesn't approve. Turns out their partner was their dog, right? And it's like, that's kind of shady to me. So make sure you're reading through your contract. Make sure you understand what it means. And sometimes we tell sellers this all the time. Hey, if you want to take 5 minutes and we'll just go through the purchase contract, the purchase and sale agreement or purchase and sale contract, we'll go through it, run through it sort of paragraph by paragraph. Make sure you understand each piece and component. Make sure you understand what you're getting into. And sometimes we've had sellers that sort of hold up and don't want to sign the contract because they're scared for one reason or another. If you want a quick closing and want to get this done, like that contract, like until the title company or the real estate attorney has this contract in their possession, they really don't want to start the title search process and get the closing process going because they don't know whether this deal is actually serious or not. So make sure that you are expeditiously getting that contract back. If you have, verbally agreed to the terms of the sale, make sure you guys are getting that contract executed and back to one another ASAP. We do all of our contracts online through DocuSign, through electronic signatures since 2003, since the Electronic Signature Act of 2003. An e-signature is just as good as a wet signature. Now, there are some states who have sort of created overlays on the rules and require wet signatures on certain contracts. So consult an attorney about that in your specific area. I hope this helps you out today. Those are some of the contract red flags you should watch out for if you are doing a real estate deal. So if you have a property that you're trying to sell, you'd like to get a cash offer on it, we'd love to make you a cash offer. We buy properties all over the country. Or if you feel like you want a real estate agent, you want to go the traditional route, I have a hand-picked network of real estate agents that I work with all over the country that are probate inheritance specialists. Be happy to get you in touch with one of those agents to help you get your property sold. So again, I'm Brad with probateresource.com. Thanks for watching this video. Have a great day. Bye-bye.